So what I thought was I'll start by reading quite a longer poem so that we'll have quite some bit to discuss. And I have something to say about this. So I think this was when I just finished my MA and I was sort of spending some time in the countryside during the pandemic. So I accidentally walked into a 12th century church somewhere in Somerset. And so there was this notice in the church and it said, like no services, virtual services only because of the pandemic. But it's a countryside, so there are very few people and nothing's locked, so I really wanted to go in. Now while I stood there, I was thinking about it's completely empty, and then there were all these 18th, 19th century tombs all around of people who died in the First and Second World War. And I was standing there and I thought of Philip Larkin's church going, So I'm like, I want to go in, there are no services, there's no one there. I know it's a very old church, and there are all these pixies and goblins kind of, everywhere. So I wanted to go in, but I thought, okay, I don't know what this acoustic frowsty barn is worth, but it pleases me to stand in silence there. That's how it started. So I did not know this would become one poem. I was writing for 6 months about random things. I just moved to Somerset. So it's things I picked up, the stone houses, the paths, the oak tree. I would pass an oak tree and I would always think about the particular stanza from Kubla Khan. So these are all things that, I don't know, some of these were parts of my journal and I had to sit down and collate them. So this was just something I had to say to give like a starting point. So this is roughly based on a walk I had. I prefer to stand up when I read, so I hope that's okay. So this is what the poem is all about, and the poem is called Exmoor. It's set in Exmoor in Somerset, and it goes like this. From the old school house to the right is an empty country road to a tiny Taunton village, Monk Silver, beside brambles and blossoms, where bluebells crisscross daisies and foxgloves in the Exmoor. A mystic oak ogles at the peasants gone awry. The wind winnows over willow tops, befuddling white daffodils huddled up by the silver stream. Dyed sheep heedlessly sleep and stealth over frosty hills. Older stone houses on either side reminisce Sir Francis Drake's wedding at the Old Saints' Church. Old stone houses, 19th, 20th, 21st century tombs retell death's deadline, occasionally with a bell, ambushed in every stroke of the clock, tick-tock. In unison, on the rear side, tremor unnoticed memorials and martyrs of the great wars. Mumbling in mind Larkin's church going, shushing pixies carved all over the well-mowed burial yard, surreptitiously stepping inside the rusty entrance gate. I see no invitation, a notice for instant departure, a warning, warding of viruses of death, mass death, surreal, real death, indefinitely virtual services only. Behind closed doors, disturbingly wrecker, unsettling alerts, disquieting death rates. In the air stir sirens, mutating permutations of angst, anxiety, uncertainty. From the desolate church, I walk home, 100 yards away, passing beside purple clematises, crabapple blossoms, and magnolias in the yard. Startled, I halt as a horse neighs. Haven't I heard it wrong? Must it not be a mistaken noise from the Notley Arms? Shuddering, I fear carved birds and beasts from the mowed cemetery yard. Won't they scuff wooden floors at night, asking to revisit, to unbury anachronistic histories? Anxiously walking back and forth, wishing to think instead about the glossy chalet door. On it, silhouette of the green grapevine twined around thorny shrub rose stalks, From uncanniness, I seek refuge in Coleridge. Purse like pale tulip buds, my lips pipe up and read Kubla Khan in the presence of a presence, an unspeakable presence in essence. Guffaws, startled, I turn around. Ha! Prosecco bottles, open smiles alighted by the fireplace. Mum Sarah hugs me tight from behind. The dogs in my arms cuddle closer. A while, then the sun sets. Ecstatic stars await a neat black sky. Their shine, then sleep's chase, slowly housed me in a lovely morning's casket. Now, you will barge in to hear me sleep talk. Don't bother, awaken me on another day, Somerset. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a beautiful poem, Parvathy. As I was listening, there were 2-3 thoughts coming in my mind. The first is, there is clear reference to Kublai Khan and the oak tree and poetry that went much before, from previous centuries, British poetry in this case. So the first thought which arose in my mind is, how true is it that a lot of what we write as poetry, our own poetry, is sometimes an inspiration or launching from metaphors or styles or topics that have been written, and we reinvent language even though it's been written before. So
thank you, and it's a wonderful question. And you know, I did literature. I am doing my PhD in English. So, but I don't know, and I did liberal studies and so on. So every other subject has added to it. But I think for me, my teacher back in school, I had a teacher called Ms. Rajeshwari. So she used to read these poems, and I used to fall in love with the way she reads. And I used to go home and hide myself in a room, in a corner, and I would read these poems out loud, trying to read the way she used to read. And in that process, over the years, what happened was I fell in love with sitting in, reading poems out loud. And I have a really good memory. I can even say the Wasteland, most of it by heart. So because of that, I think I love close reading. I just love to, read very, very, very closely, the symbols, the commas, the punctuation. So I think with that kind of reading out loud and not consciously trying to memorize it, but I just love to sit down and just read out loud. But in that whole process, I think over the years, I've developed a kind of, I don't know, whether it's a memorizing or, when I see something, I'm like, oh yeah, that and that. So that's one thing, perhaps. But I think for me, what happened was in 2020, when I moved to London for my MA, especially I went to the School of Oriental and African Studies, and that's a very historic literary place. So when I walk around, I think, and I read, especially I love John Keats and I love T.S. Eliot in particular. So when some of these landscapes brought some of these poems, alive for me. But it's also interesting how, for example, there's a central library in Islington, so there's a statue of Bacon and Spencer. And there, and then, so it's a 16th century, it reminds me of Spencer's Bartholomew and so on and so forth. But the same streets, when you walk down, there are frozen yogurts show, and the landscape has changed so much. So sometimes, the pastness of the past and the present, to say in Eliot's words, I think these kind of consciously and unconsciously come to me for whatever reason. And it just happened that I was in some of these places where these authors were. And like, for example, I had this one Sylvia Plath poem. I went to Sylvia Plath's house. I'm standing outside, and there are these massive windows upstairs. And it was a full moon night. And then, I don't know, I was standing there, and I recalled the lines from the poem. What's that? She looked, there's a mirror. The moon, those liars, the candles of the moon, I see them back and reflect them faithfully. So it just happened that it reminded me of them, I think, some uncanny presence, perhaps. So this is one thing. I think it just comes to me one thing. But there is also a kind of fascination for close reading and how it was and how it is. But there is all these verses very fresh in mind, but the landscape has changed. But the poetry has changed, the words have changed, their implications have changed, but it's fascinating to put them in conversation.
The second thing which struck me, and it's to build on what you just mentioned, all poetry combines a time horizon which can span a century. And you have juxtaposed place, and in this case, places that were alluded to in poems, and made it your own in the present time. So there is past in the present, and in some ways you have reinvented the present. And there is no doubt, in many sense, all poetry is a poetry of reinventing our own ancestry, and there is no escaping the past, right? So, and the other thing which struck me is your poem is very multi-sensory. So there is the visual landscape coming in, but it's also very clear there are registers. Maybe it's a T.S. Eliot, or so there is that musicality or that tonality in your poem too. So while you were reading that, I was thinking which poem of mine might also try and do a similar thing, which is to go back to a previous place in history and then try to reinvent it. And it's a short poem, and I will read two short poems. This one was actually written it was actually about a place I had visited many years ago. And that image and that experience was dormant, and then after many years I wrote it, and this poem is called Song of the Dispossessed, and it reminded me of an experience near, or a visit next to the Koilandi beach. Song of the Dispossessed. This sea, between the vision of the moored metal boat in blazing sun and its cooling touch with tide, is but sadness. This sadness swells, moving with the waves of history. We learn about the lost cannon, the one that blasted the skulls of my forefathers, now found in the shipwreck, concealed by time and sea. It sways and rocks these waters like a baby's cradle, I remember. It grows, this sea, becoming the horizon itself, like the dark prank of the boy god. This is a treacherous sea, this Arabian Sea, and it cocks its eyes on me and my brown skin. This is a merciless sea, a sea without morals. It allowed the white man into my shore, into my mother tongue. So when I visited this place, and then I visited Kapad, and it took me many years to realize that Kapad was actually not the place where Vasco da Gama landed like we were taught in school. It is actually near Koilandi Beach, according to the latest historical evidence, which I learned later. But what came about spontaneously is a very strong reaction to our own colonial history, and something which came spontaneously and after many years of lying dormant. So that's one poem I could think of which tries to do the same thing, and I will read one more poem. This one can be considered in some sense as a mildly erotic or a sensual poem, and it's called The Lunar Temple. The Lunar Temple. Your sweetness lingers in my metaphor, a tasty crumb of flux, an animal rhythm that rips my heart out of its socket of rules. I lower myself into the earth's crust of thirst, coming out through a cave of sleeping leopards, of storms, creepers, and boiling wetness. The moon too has risen, a ball of chiseled fire born from your palm. Salt is your language, fever is your pitch. Nothing you touch will be the same again tonight. So this poem, of course, was much more visceral. It was one of those poems that suddenly drops and it comes more from the body, as I'm very sure would be something you have experienced. There are some poems which are maybe more cerebral and some that seem to come from our guts.
So for me, what really stood out is whilst you were reading, and I was paying close attention to it, it's just the first one had like the air of poignance around it, the sadness, and then the sea, but in kind of sort of constant dialogue with the movement. That was the fascinating part about it. Which, as you rightly pointed out in my poem, like it was again the wind, the movements, and the landscape. Moving to the second poem, what was fascinating was about the sounds in conversation with the tastes. So it's very evocative and very, 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 I like those kind of, why am I thinking about synesthesia? I don't know. Like, that's what it made me think of.
I guess all poetry is finally also a celebration of senses, right? The living experience of being in this world and being in the now and experiencing it through all the senses.
But equally, it is as aesthetic as it is. It's also very political. I mean, in the sense that the way it kind of goes on to talk about my brown skin is a way of registering, okay, this is my body, the physicality of it. But there's also that very, very political aspect of it, which is, the colonial history of the place. And so it's fascinating. So, and it's...
We should hear you now.
So this is a poem. The next poem I'm going to read is a poem I wrote based on a documentary. I watched a documentary on the BBC about the war in Syria quite some time ago, and so I was in college, the first few years of my college. And I watched the visuals of a mother carrying a baby amidst the rubble, and she's frantically trying to go somewhere. Now I saw these visuals, and I just couldn't stop thinking about it. Right? So this is, as a college student, I was in the first or second year of college when I wrote this poem. I just couldn't stop thinking about the cruelty of the world. I think more than the violence, right? A kind of, there's no response to it. As in, like, you think about the number of institutions and bodies for governance and peace and so on and so forth. How many global institutions we have, But in spite of it, a kind of a cold, ignorance, like leaving things as they are. Nothing is done about it, and that apathy is horrifying, right? I don't know, like over the last few months, I've been reading Achille Mbembe's book. I think everyone should read this book, Necropolitics, and I don't know. So this is why I thought I'll read, old as it may be. I just wanted to read this poem, considering the world in which the backdrop of the events that unfold. I think I don't know whether it's the post-pandemic world as well. Where so many people dying has become. You don't feel anything about it. You say hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, but where it's become a part of the daily vocabulary of sorts, and that kind of injustice being brushed off like that is so daunting. So that's why I choose to read this poem, and it goes like this. I prefer to stand when I read poetry, so it goes like this. The poem is titled "Away She Sauntered in Syria," and it goes like this. Amidst all strife and heaps of corpse, bloodstains, bizarre rows of war, she strolled sewn pose, her baby close in the warmth of her bosom. Stream of tears, ascetic than acids, frozen with fierceness, numbness of pain, knowing that nowhere can soothe her or please. She babbled and wiggled, begging for mercy. Noxious fumes flew all way round, bloodthirst, wrath resounded, terror. Gunshots replaced the chime of church bells. Gospels did swoon, and peace begone. The gleam in her eyes is lost for long. Her kith and kin have all turned ashes. The grace of lies is all that surrounded. Horrors of war is all that resounded. Horrors of war is all that resounded. Nowhere to go, nobody to rescue. She wandered and wandered, her baby held close, close to her bosom. Beaten, bruised, abused and cursed, ripped and torn, bitten to bits, soaked in blood, flesh fresh and red, iced with love, she ran, masked midst wreck, for trace of rest, breastfed her kid, embraced too close. Afraid she is, not of woes, only of men with no glimpse of mercy. Oppressed all life, distressed she mutters, conquer the whole world, kill all you envy. Is that your success? A world devoid of love and life, a world so laden with remorse and pain. Nowhere to go, nobody to rescue. She wanted and wanted, her baby held close, close to her bosom. Thank you.
That was beautiful, but a huge departure from the earlier poem of beauty and memory into the grim, dark world of war. And the grace of lies is all that surrounds her. Wow, I mean, that's powerful because it's almost in denial of reality that the protagonist of this poem or the narrator of this poem seems to get some kind of a reprieve from the cruel world and the dark world all around her, and a lot of very strong, visceral emotions in that poems. So wonderful. And I've actually changed the poem because you read this one, because I was trying to pick up a poem with a tone which was much more calm. I might read it next, but I thought it would be too much of a juxtaposition for the audience. And this one, I usually don't write too many angry poems, but there was a sense of anger when the war broke out in Ukraine and Russia. And what drove this was, I have a dear Ukrainian poet friend, and I have Russian writers also as friends. And I kind of knew the turmoil the war was creating in them. And in that, spur of the moment, I wrote this poem about war to at least try and match the tonality of what you read it out. And this poem is called Marching to the Bugle. Marching to the bugle. A shadow drags itself over helmets and a slain dove, racing itself into a field of broken paddy, watches a gun licking its last smoke tucked in a cold, frozen arm. Memory adjusts his vision, and he sees sadness walking with his patriot anger. It was said that this was the sadness he knew from the story of giants coming down a beanstalk to kill children and dreams. When he becomes old, he would say that it was not the people themselves who were evil, but the stories they were told. Not the giants which killed who were evil, but the songs and speeches they marched against.
Thank you, sir, for that beautiful poem. Could you just go back to that phrase, memory, and the vision one? Could you sort of take us back to that phrase?
Which one is that?
The poem that you just read. Memory is something. The vision. Um,
I think you might be referring to memory adjusts his vision, sees sadness walking with his patriot anger.
Yeah, memory adjusting vision, right?
Yeah.
A selective, what you see, what you don't see. I don't know, I'm thinking about the politics of amnesia, kind of selective remembering, selective forgetting.
Yes.
But also, it also made me think about Hannah Arendt and the banality of evil. Like it's not really the massive giants, but it's also what
Yes.
exactly did you?
Yes, so memory, my own understanding of memory changed, and one of the reasons for that is apart from being a poet, I'm also a student of neuroscience. So I'm very interested on the cognitive aspects of memory. And one thing I learned over the years is memory is not a retrieval. It's not us recalling something that truly happened in the past. It's not like there is a compartment in your brain from which you pull out memory. But memory is also storytelling. We think something has happened in the past and we have those images running in our mind. And from that initial memory inspiration, what brain science is showing is there is a reconstruction of a narrative. And therefore, the memory is never the same memory, even for the same incident, as one grows up. The same thing which I recall when I was 5 years old, when I'm 20 years old, is not the same memory when I'm 30 or 40. It is almost as if the memory is changing as it were, with me changing. So it's almost, in some sense, looking at the memory as a protagonist which is adjusting its vision. I think similar to your protagonist's denial through the grace of lies in some sense, if that makes sense, yeah? I may read the calming poem now because I think we've read two poems about war which might be a bit intense for end of the day. I'm very preoccupied nowadays studying about Gautama Buddha. I'm a secular fan of the Buddha. So I'm going to read a poem called Gautama Said. Gautama said, "The crimson twilight is trapped in turquoise waters. Pain is the unborn seed before bodies wear and tear. Grief is a reserve waiting to emerge from contentment." Gautama said this too, and he was made a god against his will. He talked about each thing nestled in a maze of conditions, sometimes caused by the kindred, sometimes by its opposites, a matrix of causes and effects that is the buzzing word and time and our sense in the making. This is the illusion of our own story hidden in a labyrinth of feelings, perceptions, habits, and our atoms. What else? That which is our flesh and our awareness. At the same time, but neither entirely physics nor a psychology. There are things language can't reach, no, circumscribe. For words can flow only forward, like soldiers marching to their death. So eschew the metaphysic of duality, eschew all metaphysics, like the wise one did in the dance of reality. Each bit of you, each moment, and its death, that cycle of awareness trapped inside, onward, is to be lost and found and lost again, this relentless, joyous thing called living.
Thank you for the poem. Thank you for sharing it. Well, there are quite a lot of things there, and I think, I don't know, for whatever, I'm also connecting about processing what you said earlier about the passage of time in various different contexts, but also that of awareness on evolution of that, I don't know, consciousness or awareness or of knowing, of figuring out, of getting lost in finding and then losing, and, you know, and then, I don't know, a consistent state of rediscovery. I don't know if that's the right way to put it. But also, I think, I was about to say something and it slipped my mind now. Yeah, I'm kind of going back. Yeah, but also, at the same time, I also heard some very interesting words along with that, like maze and matrix. There was one more, it slipped my mind now. Yeah, like, so what are some of the aspects that you were trying to sort of...
Sure. Actually, this poem is, in some sense, my attempt poetically to render two basic tenets of early Buddhism. So one of which is anatta, or non-self. Second, which is translated as dependent origination. So the non-self view is very interesting in the philosophy of mind, because it's one of the very few philosophies which said the self doesn't exist and self is an illusion, one of the earliest to do that. And the second one, the maze or the matrix, comes from the dependent origination. So the whole dependent origination concept, which was professed by Gautama Buddha, it basically says that every phenomenon, everything that happens in a moment, has several antecedents. There is a web of cause and effect. And the cause of effect isn't linear. It is not one cause causing one effect, but it is several causes simultaneously bearing on a certain effect, and that is the way the reality or the universe functions. And everything is constantly changing. And one of the reasons why we humans are unhappy is that we try to cling to a sense of permanence in a universe which is really in flux through a self which truly doesn't exist. So saying all that in poetry was something I attempted to do with this. So the maze or the matrix are the web of cause and effect I was alluding to.
Were you sort of thinking about the cumulative, you know, I don't know, of the world, the...
Karma too, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
So, yeah, makes me think about the cumulative, you know, kind of effect of this, but one that is also subject to constant change. Am I right? Yeah, well, yeah, there's no right and wrong also. Well, I think, anyway. So I'm just sort of shifting landscapes again and going into another terrain. Well, this is actually based on a memory. So I think this was last year when I was in London for about 2.5 years, and I came home for like 2 months. And one evening, my mom was lighting the lamp, so my grandmom used to light the lamp until she passed away. So, I mean, after a long time, when you're coming home, you see your mom lighting the lamp, So I recalled how, I used to sit down with my grandmom, when you sort of do the chants in the evening. So when you light the lamp, like there's this moment where everything is dark, and my grandmom lights the lamp, my mom turns the switches on. So this, and then I remember as a young girl how I used to, play with the, agarbatti smoke. So this is the memory that I had, and I kind of developed it from that. So, it's just a very simple poem, and it goes like this. It's titled Flickering Wicks. And also, I have to say, like Dr. Ajay Thomas sir is here, and he's very kindly edited some of these poems, and he's been such an incredible mentor for me over the years, and it's such an honor to read all of these poems in front of him. I'd also like to thank Dr. Ampad Koshi, who's also been a very, very big source of inspiration for me. So the poem goes like this. It's titled Flickering Wicks, and it goes like this. Smoke zigzags from the incense waves burned at dusk. Once, they were to me blessings from the gods Grandma sang to in praise. How swiftly, softly, repeatedly I would cup them all in as she sat in prayer with her eyes closed. Before, Amma in a sweet switch eclipses the fiery Nilavilaka, while flicker wicks in the earthen lamp under tulsi leaves, dissolve slowly into the black sapphire sky. 17 years. I still trace the snaky tendrils from the incense. Sometimes I sense it smilingly or sulking, often with no thoughts or emotions. They are kisses, so far away from grandma, praise unseen. Well, I also have to say one more thing. I think sometimes when you do not realize the value of some things unless you're far away. So for me, I think all these things, you're so used to, I've never been like, I'm not that religious, right? So, and I lived in so many places over the last 10 years. So I was in Delhi for a bit and so too many movements. And when you come home and after a while you're seeing all these things. And when you're away also, I think, I don't know, I started lighting candles at some point, there's some kind of strange way of reconnecting with your roots as well. And I think when I came back as well, it was also a period of unlearning a lot of things. Like, I think growing up, I read more English literature than, Malayalam literature. I read Malayalam. I still read my newspaper in Malayalam. That's always a thing. But I think you read, British literature, British history. I studied British history. I think I said it in yesterday's session as well. I studied British history for 5 years in Kerala. And when I went to London, I had like 2-3 modules on Kerala studies. I'm doing my PhD research in London on that. It's such a contradiction, right? So I think with that also came, I am so divided about this idea of decolonizing and so on and so forth. But I think going back to Kerala history, going back to some of these things, then I think I started really thinking about, okay, what is going on? There was also an attempt to read more Malayalam and write more Malayalam, and with that also came a kind of way of connecting more deeply, a conscious way of connecting with the landscape and the place, the room, the rituals, and I think that's where this phase and shift happened.
I could clearly relate to that because this poem, compared to the first one which you read, so this one is really a poem rooted in Kerala, not just in the obvious words or the content of the poem, but I guess even the feel or the texture, or it's almost as if you could have written it in any language and not just English, and it would have been a poem about Kerala. What I really liked also, and I don't know whether this was something you used consciously or if it happened, the early part of your poem had a lot of use of l. And it's almost like through that you were softening that, making it like a soft glow memory or a soft glow recall. And to me that worked incredibly well as a reader, because whether it was swiftly, nilavilaka, I mean the la, so that play was, I think, exceptional. And the one thing I also want to add is, so Dr. A.J. Thomas is not just somebody who edited your poems or been a mentor. My first book, I had the honor of Dr. A.J. Thomas doing it too. So he has been doing this for generations of us. So thank you very much. And maybe just a short poem, and then maybe you can read a poem and we can open it if there are questions. There's a short poem called Mouth and Her Whims. Mouth and her whims. Lend me 2 tablespoons worth of grammar that my tongue and spices can abide by. This alone can free my words from the stammer of my ancestors, so I can weave sounds as I please, as I go, watching the sun come down as a disguised crescent. Breath rises to touch me, her lips a fence, all shrub, all thorn, a few scented flowers. Grace is silence, a fluid door of stories, blanketing all that arrives here in peace, in peace, in peace.
The particular aspect that really, struck me was the recollection in peace. I don't know, I can't help but think about the romantics. I'm going back. So could you sort of talk us through that? That's what really stood out to me.
So there are some memories which aggravate, and there are some memory that soothes. And this is one of those which was a playful, soothing, self-healing kind of a memory. It's almost like recalling aspects of my lived past experience, which I wouldn't mind replicating or repeating or experiencing again. So to that extent, it was invoking peace through certain lived experience, sensations, and playfulness, but doing all that to get to a sense of lull and calm and peace. So a sort of a meditative or a meditation through invoking of nice memory, if you will.
The replaying, it's hard not to think about the last answer of the daffodils, I can't remember it. I know I can't pick the last answer just now. As I lie on the couch in vacant or in pensive mood, I flash upon that inward thought, the bliss of solitude. That's what it reminds me of, the kind of pleasant, delightful recollection and replaying of that in the mind for solace, for hope, for comfort, or joy. It's really lovely. It's interesting how, poetry and genres, I don't know. So may I ask if you studied in India? Did you study literature?
I didn't study literature. Actually, I was very confused as to what I wanted to study. My first degree was BCom, and then I did a master's in psychology and ended up doing management. But I did study in India right through first 15 years in Kerala, then kept hopping, Andhra, Bangalore, Jamshedpur, etc. Never had the pleasure of studying literature, so a lot of it is very instinctive, intuitive, through reading other poets over the years, etc. But a lot of my writing these days and the last few years, I think, have been greatly influenced by philosophy of mind and cognitive science. I'm always looking at poetry as a window to show how our cognition works and what happens in a single cognitive moment in a human brain. Poetry is a fantastic byproduct of that, and poets watch things closely. And so my literary criticism, if you can call it that, is very much guided by the behavioral science or philosophy.
That's fascinating. Well, I might have like a controversial point on this, but I would, I would just say it as I think. I think I studied literature too much that at a point I decided I am not studying this because I just did not want to do that in a particular way. So I think that's when I branched out into liberal studies and development studies and human rights. I love to read literature, but I think sometimes some of the methodologies are quite suffocating. I think that's just my take on it. So that's one thing, but it's also really fascinating how you have reconciled so many different aspects of it, but it also made me think about something really interesting. So I've been conducting workshops with school students or college students or university students, whatever, or teaching in London or here. It's really interesting, more than I've taught at schools and I'm teaching at a college in London, but what I've noticed is Indian students have, very close readings of Wordsworth and Coleridge, the Romantics in particular. But why is it that we do not have that kind of intimacy with any kind of regional literature? And I'm included here. So I think there is some kind of, I don't know, this comes from an angst of having to create, the inevitability of creating a space where we will make sure that that identification happens also across regional, poems or forms or themes. And I think this is something that I have missed out as a student who studied it. I did my first BA and my MA in Kerala before I went to Delhi or anywhere else. I think so this kind of is something that I felt like mentioning here, of having to read more Malayalam poets and Malayalam, translations and between, so that, this would become, and I think this is why, I want to make a point about, I don't know, this is why public platforms like this are important, I think. Syllabus revisions, I think it's pathetic. After 30 years, the syllabus is still not revised, and the politics of it, faculty not having control over it. And I think, why are we still doing 5 years of British history without, one proper module on Kerala studies or, Indian history or Indian literature? I think this is, especially when I went to, in London, you're studying Kerala history. I went to SOAS, and the first few lectures were all on Pabilio Buddha, right? So I think that is really sad, and that's, so for me, decolonizing is a very problematic concept. What does it mean? I'm trying to decolonize from the West. Who am I writing for? The Western audience. So it's this kind of hypocrisy is quite maddening and frightening. So I really did want to make a point, but this is why I think a lot of us have no perspective on the society around this. It keeps, like what I said about war, about things leaving just unaddressed. It's never talked about, never written about, no one's talking. Things is, exactly what the syllabus was 30 years ago. But I think liberal arts universities have, managed to change this quite a bit. But the problem with that is the hierarchy that it creates. I studied at Ashoka University for a year. I have done that. I also studied at St. Teresa's. I did my BA and MA in Kerala before I went to SOAS. And I studied at 3 different universities in the UK as well. But everywhere people are unlearning. We are still doing what we were doing before, and that's very sad, And I think reading poetry or literature, I think, is also an important part of that. That's something I wanted to say.
I completely agree with you. And part of the decolonization, I would also extend or build on what you already said. I mean, certainly it's the Indian regional languages, but also, and in this audience, we have a wonderful African writer, and we have a West Asian writer, and a Mexican writer. We don't connect with a lot of the Asian poetry. I mean, one of the things, as I started living in other parts of Asia, Malaysia, Hong Kong now, is just the sheer wealth of literature which is non-Western and which we don't connect with. And therefore, we are still largely fed, I think, by a Eurocentric or an Anglo-centric appreciation of poetry and poetics. Even our devices for poetics are Western. We don't think about Chinese poetics or Indian poetics or Indian ways of interpreting poetry. So it's an essential part of decolonization. I totally agree with you. And I'm glad you brought that up. And maybe we should invite questions if there are any. We have only 5 more minutes, I think, left.
Is there any questions from the audience side? So I would like to ask you a question, Mr. So you guys belong to 2 different generations, and there is a lot of changes happening in the poetry as well. So do you find any interesting or inspiring poetry or poem? And did you notice these changes as well?
Yes, all the time. So firstly, even before poetry, let me tell you, to some extent it starts from home, because I have 2 teenage daughters. Actually, no, that's not right. My elder one has turned 20 years, so she would object to my calling her a teenager. Poetry or literature, to a great extent, is catering to a certain generation, or when a poet from a certain generation writes, it's using the registers and tones. So I'm acutely aware, for example, of certain idioms or expressions or phrases or even themes which may not work for my two daughters. I mean, they would find it very uninteresting. I've seen, but this is not unusual for poetry. If you think about poetry as an art and one's own personal history as a poet, one doesn't write poetry the same way that one wrote 10 years ago or 5 years ago. Certainly, if you take a 20-year span, it changes. Like, I wouldn't write some of the poems I would have written 20 years back now, because it just seems to be offbeat with the way the world is. But then again, yes, today's generation is more similar across the world than how my generation was similar. You could say the new generation in India and the UK or emerging markets may be similar, but there are also a lot of nuances and textures depending on the place. So someone who's young in Kerala is different from someone who's young in Hong Kong. So there is that localization also. So I feel very energized actually with exposure to the younger generation. So I'm actually delighted that I could share the platform with Parvathy.
It's been an honor, sir. I mean, I was thinking about also, you know, the beyond the generational aspect of it. Well, you could also think about how different people are sort of, you know, whether it's the digital media, how that has sort of revolutionized the length, the attention span, all these things are to be taken into consideration. But also, you know, kind of working with other media and other modes. For example, you know, for example, you know, you go to some of these exhibitions, you have like sound and verse, or you know, light, and you know, there are all kinds of, you know, kind of works being done. So that's something that I thought of. I think even digital poetry, digital art, you know, I think crypto, you know, I don't want to get into it, but either poetry, I think I did go for a lecture on either poetry, so I'm just processing. So there are so many things that are happening, and I think technology has also revolutionized it. So that's something that I wanted to mention. But also artists working across media, across modes, collaborative, you know, projects between artists. I think these are all new things to think about at present.